Good afternoon. I'm Ralph Raybach, Holocaust survivor and member of Illinois Holocaust Museum's Board of Directors. On behalf of the museum's CEO, Bernard Cherkasov, the Board of Directors, staff, and volunteers, thank you for attending this afternoon's program. Here and now, anti-Semitism today. Anti-Semitism has been on the rise in the United States in recent years. In 2022, there was a 36% increase in anti-Semitic incidents, the highest number on record since the Anti-Defamation League began tracking anti-Semitic incidents in 1979. In the last 2 months, since the October 7 Hamas terrorist attacks in Israel, that number has increased dramatically, with a more than 330% increase in reported incidents of anti-Semitism here in the United States alone. One of the many ways Illinois Holocaust Museum is responding to this increase in anti-Semitism is through its brand new programming initiative, named Understanding and Confronting Anti-Jewish Hate. This program today is the second in the series of programs focused on helping the Chicagoland community identify and address anti-Semitism head-on. The alarming explosion of anti-Jewish hate requires each of us to act. But before we can work to combat anti-Semitism, we must understand what it is. Here to answer such questions as what does and does not qualify as anti-Semitism, and how has anti-Jewish hate transformed throughout history. With us is renowned scholar Mark Weitzman, COO of the World's Jewish Restitution Organization and senior U.S. delegate to the International Holocaust Remembrance Authority, IHRA. Welcome, Mark, in educating us this afternoon and answering these important questions.
Thank you very much, Ralph, and it's a pleasure to be back, virtually at least, in Illinois. One of, I think, the best Holocaust museums and institutions that we have in the U.S., and it's really a privilege to be returning with you again. Can you see me? I've taken the video off on, so I hope it's all working properly. I want to begin by actually taking off a little bit on the title that of today's program, which is Anti-Semitism Here and Now, and actually expand it a little bit, because to understand the here and now and anti-Semitism, we have to understand as well in a way, the there and then, where anti-Semitism came from. It did not spring in the wake of October 7th. It did not spring forth as if it had never been there before, but it clearly drew on roots, tapped into deep-seated forms of anti-Semitism that had been lurking in the background or foreground of our times. And I think to really get a picture of it, a handle of it, we need to take a look at that. And even though we're going to focus on the United States in this talk, I'm going to try to expand it a little bit beyond the United States as well. So first, I want to begin by showing this slide, which is the picture of the latest volume, The Routledge History of Anti-Semitism, which I'm hoping the museum library will have a copy of, if not now, but eventually, because it really is broken up into 40 chapters by leading scholars and experts. It was just published in September, right before the October terrorist attack. But it gives a background in 3 different categories. One is chronologically, a survey through the ages, different periods, classical, medieval, modern, and current anti-Semitism. Second is geographically, broken down by countries and regions. And the third is topically, by different topics ranging from anti-Semitism in art to Holocaust denial and distortion to religion, and finally to a couple of Jewish responses to anti-Semitism as well, both Zionism as a response to anti-Semitism and Jewish religious responses in the 19th and 20th centuries, some examples of that as well. So the book is unfortunately very expensive. That's the publisher's choice. We had no say in that, which is why I'm hoping the library might have a copy of it. But it also, the chapters are 15 to 20 pages, and they're written in very accessible, open manner for anyone who wants further background on any specific contents that we may be referring to today. So I'm going to begin by going back to the start of colonial history, basically, in the United States. And I'm speaking here in New York. And in New York, one of the icons of New York, as many of you might know, was the Dutchman Peter Stuyvesant. So much that his statue is still in New York. One of the elite New York academic high schools is named after him. Housing development, streets, and so on are still named after Stuyvesant. But Stuyvesant was an outright anti-Semite who tried to keep Jews from entering and settling in New Amsterdam. And in 1654, he wrote, as you could see, the deceitful race, such hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ. He wrote that to his bosses in Amsterdam, trying to keep Jews out. And he did not want them allowed in, worried that if they come in, who knows, maybe Catholics might come in next. His bosses, as we now know, were clearly not in favor of that and rejected Stuyvesant's approach, turned them down. Jews were admitted to New Amsterdam, and as a result, Jews entered what would later become New York and established the seeds of what would be probably the largest population of Jews in any urban center in the Western world there. But the reason I'm bringing this up is there are a couple of points here. One, I want to show you that from the very beginning of the U.S. history, prehistory, colonial period, before the British even came in, anti-Semitism was present and imported from Europe onto this continent. Secondly, the form of anti-Semitism, notice what form it took. Hateful enemies and blasphemers in the name of Christ. It was a Christian anti-Semitism, a religious-based anti-Semitism. And third, it was allied to hatred of other groups, such in this case Catholics, and we know that Stuyvesant was also a slave owner, and it was I guess we would say, an equal opportunity bigot in today's world. So these are three factors that we will see continuing throughout history. Scholars, when they're talking about the United States in terms of anti-Semitism, often use the expression American exceptionalism, or had been using that expression, I should say. And the idea that was that the U.S. history was different from Europe, and the history of anti-Semitism in the U.S. was much more minimal than Europe. And I think we should keep that in mind and see how true that was, or where there are differences, and where that leads us. So beginning with the roots of the Christian anti-Semitism that Stuyvesant spoke about and wrote about were laid at the very beginning of Christianity, when the typology that came out, people like John or St. John Chrysostom, or even St. Paul, or people like Pope Innocent here expressing it, was that the Jews had become a degenerate people at the time that Jesus was sent to redeem them. This degenerate people rejected that offering by God and committed the act of deicide. And as a result, they were damned and condemned to wander in a diaspora, exile forever afterwards. They were not wiped out, because in the paradigm that was created by Augustine, the idea was that they were needed, their survival was needed to testify to the second coming. But they were needed as servile, as second-class citizens. They were open for persecution, just not for total elimination. And this was the attitude that persisted in the church, and you can see it embodied here in Innocent II, the Third's remarks at the beginning of the 13th century, that Jews by their own guilt crucified the Lord. They are condemned to be slaves thereafter. And this attitude permeated itself and started breaking out in different ways throughout the centuries. So by 1349, for example, when the Black Plague spread throughout Europe, murdering thousands not murdering, causing the deaths of thousands of Europeans, of Christians, Jews who were living isolated in ghettos or in their own community, sections, and had different hygienic habits commanded by ritual law, habits including ritual baths and cleansing themselves and food prohibitions and so on, were the number of victims, of Jewish victims, was less than that of Christians. And as a result, given the superstition and lack of knowledge of science and hygiene at that point, and of public health, Jews were blamed for poisoning the well. So you can see the crucified figure. Remember, Jews were responsible for the crucifixion, going into the well. And as a result of that blame, they were sometimes even burned at the stake, as the next illustration shows.
Mark, you're not sharing your screen.
It's not sharing?
No.
I don't know what happened there. Let's try again. Hang on 1 second. I apologize for that. I thought it was on. Okay, is that better?
Perfect.
All right, so we didn't see the earlier slides, I gather.
No, we did not.
All right, I'm going to just quickly show them back quickly again. All right, that's the volume that I was talking about, the new volume published in September. This is Peter Stuyvesant and the quote that I mentioned, Pope Innocent, being 13th century, and the illustrations of poisoning the wells, as well as the burning at the stake. And then we're up to here. So we can see this theme continuing to carry through with, for example, just the recent COVID pandemic, where, for example, some blame Jews. Every single aspect of the COVID agenda is Jewish. Some compared themselves, if they didn't want to be vaccinated or accept public health measures, compared themselves to Jewish victims in the Holocaust and adopted the yellow star as their symbol. And we see that even in some avowed presidential candidates at this point. But the themes continue. And one of the things we're going to see is how the themes that were established centuries ago play out to this day, even if they originated in Europe or elsewhere, are playing out in the United States. The anti-Semitism and forms of anti-Semitism was not only written or oral, it was even visual. This is the Cathedral of Strasbourg, and you can see the same images in many churches, including the famous Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, where there are two statues. The one standing erect with the head up and the staff strong and straight is the church, is Ecclesia, and she's triumphant, victorious, looking to the future, to the God for support. And the broken figure with the head down and bowed, the broken staff, looking downward, despondent and downcast, is the synagoga, because these images reflected the relative positions of the church and Christianity versus Jews and Judaism. So these symbols, even if you were illiterate, these symbols were all around you. And if you look at many of the classics of Western art, for example, they mimic these same kind of ideas. So if we go forward a little bit more, the first challenge to Christianity, really, and the Christian intellectual domination of European thought, was posed by Martin Luther, the German theologian who's the father of Protestant Christianity. And Luther first appealed to the Jews, thinking that his criticism, his critique of the Catholic Church as being full of idolatry because of all the images and idols and saints and so on, would appeal to Jews who would, in his mind, join him immediately. And when they didn't and preferred to stay in their own religion, he turned on them virulently. And in a 1543 pamphlet on the Jews and their lies, wrote that, and this is incredible, that synagogues and schools be set on fire, that prayer books destroyed, rabbis forbidden to preach, homes razed, show no mercy or kindness, no legal protection, and poisonous and envenomed worms should be drafted into forced labor. Now, what's scary about this, and we don't draw as historians, or in general, I would recommend that we don't draw such simplistic straight lines over 400 years time. But if you read this as a tract that was published in Germany in 1543 and flash forward 400 years to 1943, you can't help but be struck by the seeds that were planted that flowered in Germany and spread throughout Europe, that were foretold in a certain way by Luther's writings. So now both forms of Christianity, both Catholicism and Protestantism, were both saw themselves as superior and good versus Jews as poor or wicked. And this was termed Christian supersessionism, the idea that Christianity inherited God's promises and Jews were disenfranchised and were second class and open for abuse and persecution. The challenge to the religious domination of Europe came from the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was the introduction of scientific thinking, of reason, intellectual reasoning, into thought that challenged the religiously received doctrines of the time. And it was led by, among others, the Frenchman Voltaire. And Voltaire targeted Jews, not initially because of who they were, although that kind of changed a little bit as it went on, but actually the way he got to it was his target was Christianity at first, but the Christians were the people of the Bible. And who were the inheritors or the possessors of the original Bible, the Christian Old Testament? They were the Jews. So Voltaire's enmity of Jews actually began targeting through Christians and then mutated or headed into taking on Jews. And as he wrote here, that the Jews have surpassed all nations in impertinent fables and bad conduct and barbarism. You deserve to be punished for this, your destiny. So even though he was anti-religious, he had inherited the idea that Jews deserve to be punished as their destiny. And this was a letter that he wrote. Now, I want to point out very specifically that not everybody associated with the Enlightenment, not every Enlightenment figure was anti-Semitic. There were people who were neutral. There were people who were expressed friendship towards Jews. But Voltaire's attitudes as being the towering figure of the Enlightenment that he was certainly left a deep impression on civilization at that time, Western civilization. The next stage in this evolution was based on the findings of Charles Darwin in the mid-19th century. And Darwin, as we know, wrote about the evolution of the races, the animal races, how humanity evolved as well. And this created something called social Darwinism, which was the application of Darwin's theories to the human world. And Darwin was not an anti-Semite. Darwin was not responsible for the direction that many of his or some of his followers took. This is a Frenchman who took it in the direction of writing a book, or The Inequality of Human Races. And here they created the false taxonomy of dividing the human race into different categories, positioning the Aryan race at the top and positioning people of color and Jews on the bottom, Jews as malignant, people of color as just inferior. And you can already see from here the roots to Nazi ideology very quickly, very clearly. Jovenel was followed by people like Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who was the son-in-law of the composer Richard Wagner, who was Hitler's idol, and had direct contact with the Nazis and influenced the early Nazi ideology. And this form of racialized science or pseudoscience became a third strand of anti-Semitism. You had the religious anti-Semitism, you had the intellectual anti-Semitism of the Enlightenment, and now you have a pseudo-scientific basis for anti-Semitism as well. This played out, by the way, even in the term anti-Semitism, which was not prominent. It was used a couple of times, but not really prominent until the late 19th century, when another German, a man named Wilhelm Marr, a publicist, coined the term or adapted the term to be used because he wanted to legitimize anti-Semitism in the new scientific intellectual world and divorce it from the street rabble of anti-Judaism of the time. So he was looking for something that was more accessible, more permissible, sounded better, and came up with the term anti-Semitism. That's where it came from. One of the reasons that scholars, and I totally subscribe to this, try to avoid spelling it with a hyphen is that there's no Semitism. There is no Semitic race. It's an artificial construct. And if you hyphenate it, you give that legitimacy. So we prefer spelling anti-Semitism with a lowercase a and as one word all the time. The next form, or the next element in brick in the edifice of anti-Semitism was at the turn of the 20th century, embodied by the notorious Protocols of the Elders of Zion, first published around 1903, which laid out supposed plot of a group of Jewish elders gathered in Basel, Switzerland, which is where the first Zionist conference was in late 19th century. I'm sorry. And the idea there was that a small group of Jewish leaders had plotted to take over the world, and they were doing it by applying their financial means to control the economies, to control the press, to do all sorts of things, whatever it took to control the world through surrogates, the surrogate rulers who were the public rulers of the world, were the kings or elected officials. They were all in thrall to this plot of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The protocols, if you ever read them, are fairly ridiculous. They're just terrible reading. They were literally plagiarized, as the Times of London showed in the 1920s already, partially from a French political tract of the mid-19th century. They include such ridiculous things as claiming that subway tunnels that were being built in the capital cities of Europe at the time and financed by some Jewish financiers were stocked with dynamite that the Jews were threatening to use to blow up the cities, such as Paris, Moscow, London, whatever, if they did not get their way. And we know from the intervening over 120 years that while there was a lot of violence and bombings and explosions in European cities, unfortunately, none of them were set off in subway tunnels by dynamite that was collected through Jewish means. So they're ridiculous on the face of it, but their enduring power is such that if you look at the original Hamas charter of 1988, Article 32, it literally quotes the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. They literally say, as was written in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So we can trace a direct thread from this kind of conspiratorial anti-Semitism to our time and to the events in Israel in October. The protocols were brought to the U.S. by perhaps the greatest industrialist of the 20th century, Henry Ford, who took his publication, The International Jew, the Dearborn Independent, and produced a version of the protocols called The International Jew, which he published and put all his prestige and authority behind. Ford eventually had to back down under pressure from the Jewish community. There were boycotts organized, there were lawsuits, and Ford eventually backed down, apologized. And two important or they're not really side notes. One is that Ford was one of Adolf Hitler's heroes. He had a bust of Ford in his office, and Ford received decorations from the Nazis. The second thing, and I want to make it really clear as well, is that none of Ford's descendants seem to inherit these feelings at all. There was never any issue with anyone else in the Ford family through our time today. So I don't want this to be seen as an as a call for boycotting Fords or anything like that. But the influence was he industrialized anti-Semitism, mass-produced it, brought it to the United States, and as such is responsible for the groundwork of a lot of the things that we're dealing with today. That was not the only form of anti-Semitism. There was also a social anti-Semitism in the United States. And I'm fast forwarding at this point. I'm not including things like when Grant expelled the Jews during the Civil War, and Abraham Lincoln had to overrule him, or even the lynching of Leo Frank in the early 20th century in Georgia, in Atlanta, Georgia, because that was a relatively, really an isolated case. But here we had the social anti-Semitism of the early 20th century, where Jews and dogs were not allowed in certain places. It's very similar to the Jim Crow experience that blacks had in the United States. in resorts and high-class hotels. Certainly, Jews were limited in their admissions to elite colleges, to law firms. There was a recognition from the intellectual and political and social leadership of this country, people who ran Harvard and Yale and Columbia, for example, that too many Jews is something that they did not want to deal with. They would only allow a limited, very limited number to enter their halls. At the same time, there was a popular anti-Semitism that was growing through the efforts of the groups like the Klan, which in the 1920s was growing rapidly in size and influence. These are some Klan documents from the 1920s, and I'm not going to go through all the details, but I just want to point out that if you can read them, they talk about the Klan as upholding the laws of the United States government, as being true patriots of the United States. And that's important to keep in mind as we go along, because we're going to see something related to that a little bit later that is very different. So the Klan's influence, I just wanted to point out, peaked around, this is in 1925, where there was a mass protest, a mass march of the Klan on Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the Capitol in Washington. Numbers were estimated at close to 400,000. And you could see them walking down the Capitol in the background and unafraid, unmasked even, to show their faces. They were dominant political powers in places like Kentucky and Indiana. They owned governors, they owned senators. It turned out he ended up as a very liberal Supreme Court Justice. Hugo Black was a Klan member in his youth. They were really a force on the American scene, and their mix of anti-Semitism, anti-Catholicism, and of course racism was something that struck a popular chord at that time. The 1920s, the Klan finally receded. There were internal squabbles. They were sort of broken apart a little bit, and their power receded. But as their power receded, other nativist anti-Semites took their place. One of perhaps the most prominent was Father Charles Coughlin, who began as an ally of Roosevelt through the Depression, through the early days of the New Deal. But as FDR's presidency continued, Coughlin, for various reasons, became more sympathetic to Nazi Germany, and his voice was incredibly, incredibly powerful. He was the most popular radio speaker. And remember, radio was the only real form of mass entertainment, mass media at that time. Television was barely around. There was no, certainly no computers or anything like that. And Coughlin's range was more than any newspaper could gather. He spoke to millions of people on a regular basis, and he turned bitterly anti-Semitic. He was finally silenced by the Catholic Church itself. But until then, he spread a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism through the U.S. And this type of anti-Semitism, it's not well known, but for example, in World War II, in the middle of World War II, as the U.S. was fighting the Nazis in Germany, in New York and Boston, two of the major liberal centers with large and influential Jewish population, there were groups of Catholic, particularly young people, who went on anti-Semitic rampages, vandalism and violence, to the point where commissions had to be appointed, steps taken and efforts taken to protect the Jewish community from them. There were links between Nazi spies and some of Coughlin's followers as well. So the anti-Semitism was not just verbal, but literally spread in the United States, that he spread into physical acts of both treason and violence. At the same time, there was a strong element within the German American community. And again, not everyone. German Americans were probably the largest ethnic stock in the United States around the time of World War I, certainly very strong still World War II. And there was a group in it, extremist group, led by this man, Fritz Kuhn, who created the German American Bund. And Kuhn's group was large enough. The arena that you see filled there is Madison Square Garden in New York, one of the, as I'm a sports fan, so whenever I tune into the broadcast, I always hear them calling it the world's most famous arena. And yet it could be filled and these were not neo-Nazis, these were Allied Nazis, the original Nazis. You see the swastika behind Kuhn. And this took place in the early days of World War II. The FBI finally broke up the group, and Kuhn was imprisoned, and they didn't amount to much at the end, but they certainly posed a threat and a scare on the American scene. Coughlin had a couple of aides. One here that you see, Gerald L.K. Smith, another Wesley Swift. Smith became a longtime anti-Semitic rabble-rouser. His career continued through the 80s into the early 90s. Wesley Swift as well had another influence. He was based on the West Coast. And Swift was the kind of originator of or a transmitter of a religion, a pseudo-religion that began under Henry Ford. One of Ford's allies actually brought it in, called British Israelitism. And you don't need to remember that detail that much, but it influenced a lot and grew into the religion of the Aryan nations. Swift actually led, sort of, I guess we could say, ordained, or was the teacher, mentor of this man, Richard Butler. And Butler's group, the Aryan nations, became really a force and a force for violence in U.S. anti-Semitism in an unprecedented manner. They had a compound in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. They were responsible for a number of murders at that time, but more than that, they created in their ideology. I'm going to go ahead a little bit, and then this ideology called Christian identity was their religion, which basically said that the true Christians were the inheritors of God's promise. Jews were actually descended from the marriage of Eve and the serpent and Satan in the Garden of Eden, and as such, Jews and mud people who they controlled were the arch enemies. And sorry about this. And I want you to look at this, because this is what they actually did was issued a Declaration of Independence and a declaration of war in the early 1980s, and they created a system, an ideology, where the U.S. government was called the Zionist-occupied government, and they went to war. People who were imprisoned, they called prisoners of war for their ideology, and they were responsible for the deaths of a number of Jews, most famously radio talk show host, but also targeted people wearing U.S. uniform, whether state troopers or even postal workers were killed. And this declaration of war, the separation of between and of independence between the extreme right-wing extremists of this type was, if you recall, the Klan's early statement that they were American patriots. These people rejected the authority of the United States government, rejected U.S., and saw themselves as trying to carve out an independent homeland. And ever since then, if you call it neo-Nazi or whatever you want to term, underground in the U.S. has seen themselves at war with the federal authorities, and do not consider any kind of authority above the county sheriff, perhaps, as being binding on them. And that is a sea change in American extremism. I'm going to go back a little bit. One of the prominent leaders of the Aryan nations at that time, a man who considered himself an ambassador at large, was the notorious David Duke, who is still active today. And there you see Duke as a Klan leader. And in the middle picture, you can see Duke and a man named Don Black. And Black, who was very close to Barry Duke's ex-wife, was the creator of the first racist website, really, the first popular one, called Stormfront, which is still around. And Black was the man who has popularized the use of the internet for neo-Nazi, for anti-Semitic propaganda. That's why I'm including him in here. And from Stormfront, as I mentioned, you could see how, for example, according to ADL, anti-Semitic posts spiked after the October 7th attack, particularly on Elon Musk's X, formerly Twitter, and the dangers that are posed by social media. Because at least in the early days of the internet, things were curated. You had to go through, you couldn't post them yourself directly. Now with social media, obviously, anything gets posted, anything is legitimized, and we all know the issues associated with that. X is perhaps the most notorious of that, or known of those, but other sites such as Gab or Rumble or Telegram, or all have issues with allowing and legitimizing anti-Semitism online. and that's the religion, Christian identity that I mentioned. So fast forward to the 2016 presidential campaign, and this is a man named Richard Spencer, who at that time sort of tried to create something called the alt-right. And what Spencer tried to do with others, I'm sort of focusing on just one or two, highlights here. What he tried to do was to create a movement of young people who are not so identified as neo-Nazis, but so they could infiltrate the political system, but really reflected those kind of ideologies. And this is the night after Trump's election. You see Spencer at a gathering celebrating, giving a Nazi salute to his followers. Spencer was one of the planners of the Charlottesville March, which really, for a lot of us in the United States, was the first time we were confronted with mass anti-Semitism since the days of the Klan March in the 1920s on Pennsylvania Avenue. And the idea that people could march down the street of a major American city with giving the Nazi salute, chanting, "Jews will not replace us." Jews will not replace us is a theory called the Great Replacement Theory. It was originated by a Frenchman, René Camus. And the idea there is very simply that Jews are pushing out white Christians to replace them either by themselves or with immigrants from poorer countries, particularly from Arab and Middle Eastern countries that could be controlled very docilely by the Jews. And this great replacement theory has found a foothold in American politics as well. Some of the extremists in Congress have parroted forms of it. But this is the first time it appeared on the mass scene in the United States. So continuing, I want to go to the January 6, 2021 insurrection at the Capitol, where I'm not going to discuss in great detail, but I want you to focus on, see the gentleman in the black t-shirt with the beard, and his shirt read Camp Auschwitz. And part of the ideology or part of the methodology of these groups is not necessarily denying that the Holocaust took place or anything like that, but using Holocaust distortion. We saw it at the COVID, the use of the yellow star, the analogy to victims of the Holocaust there. We see it here basically saying that Auschwitz was not a labor camp, it was a summer camp. It was not a death camp, it was a place where people, could go for recreation. And the idea there being that a lot of the institutions and a lot of our society has actually grown out of the revulsion that the world felt about the Holocaust. And I'm talking about things like NATO or the EU or the UN, for example. Concepts like genocide, human rights, crimes against humanity, war crimes, all those are underpinnings of Western society today, liberal society with a small L. And if you want to undermine that and destroy that and return to a World War II, pre-Holocaust world where racism and anti-Semitism was acceptable socially, politically, and so on and so forth, then those concepts have to be attacked. If you want to get into the sense of fake news and delegitimization of countries like Israel, the history has to be destroyed. So history becomes a target as much as the Capitol, as much as any of the people, Jews or other people under attack. And part of the reaction result we're seeing recently, the FBI director warning that anti-Semitism is reaching historic levels in the US. We knew that, that's our gut feeling. We see it all around us, but it's being recognized by officials like the FBI director. And I think this is my final slide, but I also want to point out that, and there are a lot of statistics and polls going around, but this one just struck me, that while 73% of Jewish college students say they have experienced or witnessed anti-Semitic incidents in their campuses since the start of the 2023-24 school year, which is obviously closely aligned with the October 7th massacres in Israel, 44% of non-Jewish students said they saw the same and it felt the same. That is an incredible statistic when you think about it. It's not just the Jewish perception. Almost half US college students have been exposed to anti-Semitism on their campuses in just the last 4 or 5 months. We are in an unprecedented situation in this country. What I've tried to do here is show a little bit how he got there, because you can see that some of the roots that things that we had talked about earlier, whether it's the religious anti-Semitism that began with Peter Stuyvesant and has continued through different forms of religious anti-Semitism today, and obviously the inlay of radical Islamist anti-Semitism through the Hamas Charter and the acceptance of that and the acquiescence of that by progressives or so-called progressives who are willing to go along with things that they should be the first people opposing, has created a situation where we have something happening in this country that we have not faced historically before. And it is not going to be easy to turn the tide around. The positive side of it, if there is one, is that, first of all, in many of these countries, in Europe and certainly the United States, the governments have recognized the difficulty in the issue and have stood forth against anti-Semitism. In the US alone, we have a national strategy on anti-Semitism. We have a special envoy on anti-Semitism, one on Holocaust-related issues as well. They do incredibly good work. Oddly enough, one of the sides of optimism that I can find is in Washington, where, believe it or not, in the Senate and Congress, there are congressional task forces on anti-Semitism that are bipartisan. And I work very closely with them. They're led by Democrats and Republicans. Their membership is Democratic Republican. Some of these members probably agree on absolutely nothing else on any issue to deal with, but on anti-Semitism they come together. When we see, for example, the unfortunate sight of a policeman in front of our institutions, the first thought, of course, is that they should never be there. It's crazy that they're there in today's world, but at least we recognize and we feel a feeling of gratitude and safety and security from them. Whereas if we went back to the European model, very often it was those policemen who led the pogrom, who stepped aside to let the mobs in. So we have differences. And I'm leaving aside now, the existence of the state of Israel, its political, its military strength is also significantly different. We recognize anti-Semitism, and we're not afraid to call it out. The IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, IHRA, I'm not going to go through it now. It's a core definition with 11 examples, roughly 7 in part at least, or all relate to Israel, 4 are more classical. It has come under tremendous attack precisely because it's become so effective. It's been adopted by over 35 countries, thousands of municipalities, institutions, universities. The world's largest group of Muslim imams have adopted it. And for the first time, it presents meaning a working definition in the sense of it's something that can be used on a practical basis. It's short, less than 2 pages, and easily understood and applied. And it's non-legally binding. It doesn't put anyone in prison for saying anything. It just says that by this definition, what you have said can be or is anti-Semitic. And now let's sit down and deal with it. Let's figure out what to do about that. And if people have a problem with it, it's because they want to have a problem with it, because they recognize that there's a tool that is potent and powerful and that calls them out and puts people on the same plane. If you want to say, something about targeting Israel or targeting Jews, then people who respond should have the same right to do that. And that's pretty much what IHRA is saying all along as well. So I think we've gone pretty far down. I'm going to stop here. I see I think there were some questions in the chats, but I did want to allow a little time for Q&A. So I'm going to stop with that now and turn it over to the questions that are available. So one question in the chat is disagreement with some of the ultra-conservative policies of the current Israeli administration equal anti-Semitism, and flat out the answer is no. As a matter of fact, the definition says that criticism of anti-Semitism is not anti-Semitic. It crosses the line only when there's a double standard applied. In other words, when you criticize Israel, for something that other countries are doing and you're totally silent on other countries, then that can, that can be anti-Semitic. It never says that you cannot criticize the state of Israel. It also says that context matters. Sometimes where you say things and how you say things reflects whether things are anti-Semitic or not. Intent is important, and even though we can't know motive, but we can see the way things are going and whether they're targeting or something, for example, that is said theoretically in an academic setting is very different from a mob chanting or threatening to physical harm to Jews. So criticism of Israel is, as it is in Israel, is legitimate. Roughly every day in the Israeli, in the world Jewish community, I'm going to say at least half of people disagree strongly and vehemently with what Israel is doing, and you can see that in the Knesset, Israel's parliament. It is only called, the people who say that it is used to stifle speech about Israel are people who are intentionally manipulating and distorting the definition for a political purpose. And the next question is, what explains the increase in alt-right anti-Semitism now since Hamas terror attacks? Well, in other words, that the anti-Semitism on the left is apparent and understandable, calling Israel a settler colonial state and so on. But if the right, extreme right, is so anti-Muslim, for example, why is anti-Semitism increasing there? Oddly enough, one of the few things that bring the extreme left and extreme right together is anti-Semitism. And I'll begin with an historical reference. The Nazi Party is a shorthand for National Socialist. It embodied a socialist element within it. The nationalist part won out over it, but it was always aimed to appeal to a certain sort of socialist type of thinking. A lot of today's propaganda, extreme left-wing propaganda, grew out of the Stalinist Soviet era anti-Zionist propaganda as well. Again, we can trace direct lines through that. But the idea Zionism equals racism was something that the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc pushed through the UN to gain popularity in the Muslim world and to target the Western world, and as well as Israel, obviously. So the strain on the left that is there in terms of anti-Semitism finds a home with the anti-Semitism on the extreme right that sees Jews as being behind conspiracies, that sees Jews as sort of venomous or infecting presences in the Western world. And I guess in some ways a vivid illustration of that was brought home to me a number of years ago when I saw a conference in the Baltimore area that was organized by a radical Muslim academic. It was a very small university. And he had two people on the same panel. One of them was the neo-Nazi leader of the U.S. Holocaust Denying Institution, the organization that centers Holocaust denial in the U.S., and this leader, neo-Nazi, was on the panel. And the other panelist was the former Attorney General of the United States, Ramsey Clark, who had resigned from Lyndon Johnson's administration in protest of the Vietnam War and swung more and more to the left and become an idol of the isolationist, anti-U.S. imperialist left. And they had no problem sharing a panel, being photographed, smiling happily together, and it just personified and a very vivid way the alliance between right and left, extreme right and extreme left, that is brought together by a common form of virulent anti-Semitism. So I hope that kind of targets that. And the double standard about Jews being considered white as well as the other. I think one of the things to do is, I think this is really important, we need to try to redefine the rules of the game right now. Our enemies have defined it and allowed and put us in certain boxes that are just inaccurate and don't belong. So, for example, Israel, the Israeli population is over 50% Mizrahi right now, meaning that Israel is not a white European state. It's a Middle Eastern state by majority. The number of Jews who fled the Arab countries, Muslim countries, around the time of Israel's birth was almost equal, actually a little bit more, I believe, than the number of Muslims who claim to have fled Israel during the Nakba. So if there was a population transfer, it worked both ways. The Mizrahim in Israel are the majority population. Israel is not a white European country by any means. We talk about refugees. We need to talk about the Jewish refugees who were forced out because of anti-Semitism from the Muslim lands. The fact that Jews are not all rich, that are certainly a high percentage of Holocaust survivors, and a good percentage of Jews live below the poverty line. The stereotypes need to be shattered. It might not fall on open ears sometimes, but we need to be strong about making the case about the historical inaccuracies and distortions that are used to fuel anti-Semitic propaganda. The definition, access to the definition of anti-Semitism, you could find it, you could Google IHRA, anti-Semitism definition. It's on the website of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. We can put it up in the chat, I guess, at that point. And the question about context matters. When I said about context matters is, for example, you could talk about Israel in terms of, let's say you're criticizing the border wall that Israel put up. If you're doing it in the context of a discussion about border walls in general, security walls, and you point out all the other countries that have security walls, whether it's in Cyprus and Greece, and I think Saudi Arabia is building one, and there's in India, Pakistan, I forget all the others, as well as, of course, the wall that is being built or was built in the United States, and you oppose to all of those walls, then okay, I accept your belief, and it's a legitimate belief to hold, even if I don't agree with it. It's a legitimate belief to hold, and it's not an anti-Semitic belief at all. But if you single out and say, out of no place, that the only wall that I'm concerned about is the wall that was built in Israel, and I would refuse to even consider anything else, etc., then you cross the line where the context is more of a double standard than legitimate open discourse on something. So the context in which things can be said, and again, as I said as well, a discussion in the classroom where people are discussing and probing different issues is very different from a mob that is aiming to really physically harm people who are Jewish or that they see as Jewish. Sometimes there are First Amendment things, rights that apply to speech that we disagree with vehemently, whether it's on campus or elsewhere. But when that crosses a line into advocating for physical violence, let's say, or intimidation, that becomes a very different situation. In terms of outlawing the KKK as a terrorist group, I'm not sure the KKK is really, at this point, they're sort of fragmented. There are different clans. They're not really the biggest threat. And the U.S. has been very careful about applying laws that outlaw different groups. We went through different stages, Sacco Vanzetti at the early 20th century, or the McCarthy scare, Red Scare, or some of the abuses of the FBI in the 1960s and 70s, where authority was misused to stifle legitimate protest or harm people who were seen to be advocating for different beliefs. And I think they're going to be very careful about going down that line. However, some of the clans were bankrupted by civil actions, by actions that, for example, when they were found to have targeted individuals, they were sued on civil grounds. In case of at least one lynching afterwards, they were bankrupted by millions of dollars. The Aryan Nations was bankrupted as well. Some of their, by the way, I should point out that when they commit a crime or when they advocate for a crime, that has to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. So there were people from some of those groups that ended up with life sentences and died in prison. It took out some of the leadership of those groups. Some of the civil settlements require them to sell off all assets, including, for example, the compounds or anything that they owned, and effectively bankrupted them. I believe that there are investigations now going into Hamas's influence on American groups, particularly through money laundering and financial ways, and that's being investigated, I believe, by the government these days. And if they can draw a strong enough trail and get enough evidence, I believe they will go after them and try to deal with them legally. That the next question on here is about non-Jewish allies. So first, I really want to, and I really, really appreciate this question, and I should have pointed it out. I touched a little bit earlier when I talked about the governments, but I should point out that a huge difference today, and thank you for that question, is that the majority of the American population is not only not close to anti-Semitic, but strongly supportive of Jews, and particularly except for the younger cohort, really strong on support for the state of Israel's existence and safety. That is a huge difference, obviously, from what happened even in the last century in Nazi-occupied Europe, where it wasn't just the Nazis. They could not have done what they did without a massive amount of local collaboration, ranging country to country. I think that's we can't ignore it. The churches, both Protestant and Catholic Nostra Aetate, 1965, have totally reworked their teachings, have delegitimized the anti-Semitic parts of it, have raised and worked hard together with Jews to become really staunch, opponents of anti-Semitism. The situation that existed prior does not exist in that regard today. For allies, and I have to say that some of our closest allies are, my co-editor was an ally in the volume that I mentioned. IHRA, the people at IHRA who represent 35 different countries, actually 40 different countries, I would say it's 50-50 or more than 50% are not Jewish and are devoting their professional lives and careers to this kind of work. So there's a lot out there that we have to be thankful for from a Jewish perspective in regard to the allies. And what they can do is, I think, relatively simple in certain ways. One is to recognize anti-Semitism, to call it out, but also to offer friendship or understanding to the Jewish community, to Jews that they know. Because I will tell you that, from every Jew that I've spoken to almost in the past few months, the sense of shock of being undermined and being a sort of feeling all of a sudden that you're a stranger and that you don't recognize the American landscape that you grew up in has been really strong and has had an impact. Expressions of support, of friendship are huge and invaluable, and are welcomed. On a practical level, as I said, to recognize anti-Semitism, but even more so, or along with that, to really make sure that our political leaders, our social leaders, understand that this is an issue that they can't run away from, they can't evade. The testimony of the university professors, the Ivy League professors on Congress, I was thrilled to see the result of that, because they couldn't get away with trying to evade the answer to the question. And that was the only way that there was an impact. If it had just been, testimony and had been sort of ignored or lowercased afterwards, minimized afterwards, nothing would have changed, nothing would have happened. The only way that change is going to happen, that thing will have an impact, is not only if we and our allies stand up, but we make sure that our leaders, the people who have the ability to act in our names, do act and are firm. And that includes making sure that there's a budget for fighting anti-Semitism, that there's the political will to do it, that the people who are elected in Congress support that and know that this is a priority, a high priority today. And I think, in practical terms, that can be really huge form of assistance. The IHRA definitions, differences from other definitions, in some ways, not so many differences. I'm sorry. I think one is shorter, it's more compact because it's not meant as an academic definition. It's not a definition to be debated in a seminar room. I have no problem with doing that. If you ask me, I could probably name 10 different definitions off the top of my head or more, forms of definitions of anti-Semitism. There's historical, sociological, political, religious, psychological, economic. I probably keep going. And that's fine. But for example, and this is a very concrete example, you're a patrolman, or there's an act of violence targeting a synagogue. People are being, yelled at or something like that. How do you know if that crosses the line to anti-Semitism or not? You're not an expert on it. You don't have a great deal of experience on it. You need some guidelines, some assistance, or you or your superior officer or the DA or whatever. IHRA fits that. IHRA is short, as I said, short definition, core, followed by 11 short examples. IHRA does not never mentions the word Zionism. It's not an ideological based document. We don't debate, an ideology or a philosophy. IHRA speaks about concrete examples. The blood libel, accusing Jews of murdering Christian children for ritual purposes, or calling Israel a Nazi state that's committing genocide, which is just totally factually wrong, for example, and has no relation to reality. Those are forms of anti-Semitism. IHRA does not say that if you do one of those things, that you should get 5 years in jail. IHRA just says that that could be a form of anti-Semitism. It doesn't say that you're anti-Semitic. It says that it's a form, an expression. Maybe there are different ways that people are anti-Semitic, sometimes unconsciously. I have a feeling that a number of the demonstrators and protesters that are on the streets really have little to no knowledge of Jews, Judaism, or the situation in Israel, and are just parroting things that they think are cool, or that their social cohort is parroting, or that someone told them to say. That's very different from hardcore Hamas supporters or hardcore, neo-Nazis. And IHRA tries to recognize that, and that's part of the context issue that I mentioned earlier. IHRA tries to encompass that as well. So IHRA is a metric. It's a form of helping clarify where there's a lot of lack of clarity and murkiness, but it is not a box that everything can be squeezed into. The other definitions are much more wordy, much more intellectual, I think more difficult to handle. They kind of gloss or try to build on IHRA. Some try to politically give more room for what they see as criticism of Israel. Sometimes they stretch that very far. I honestly, I'm glad that people are engaging with anti-Semitism these days. Obviously, I'm a strong proponent of IHRA. I was responsible for introducing the definition and for steering it to acceptance there politically. But for example, in the volume that I just published with our editors, we have people in it, even though we say at the beginning that our template is IHRA, we have people in the contributors in the volume who signed on to the other definitions or who tried, used it in their own individual chapters. And That was okay because that's an academic piece of work. It's open for discussion, but that's very different from the person who has to deal with a scene, something happening on the street, and something happening that they have to make a judgment call in a very practical, cut and dried manner. How much time do we have? Because I can keep going, and I see there are more questions. Um, do we have how much? Do we have? I'm just trying to get an answer. All right. In the meantime, let me go back to the questions.
All right, Mark, let's keep it between 1 to 3. We're kind of over time right now.
Okay, 1 and 3 minutes.
Just pick 3 questions.
Oh, 3 questions. Okay. So one question was on the scope of genocide, and has genocide changed? Well, actually, I mean, the scope of genocide technically has not changed. If you look at the Genocide Convention, and you look at the definition of genocide, that is still there. Its use has changed because it's thrown around now as a sort of emotionally charged word that's being used totally out of context. And I mean, clearly what we're talking about here is the charge that Israel is committing genocide to Palestinians, to Muslims, and why I think it's legitimate to raise questions about Israel's treatment, whether of Muslims and Palestinians, in many individual cases or in generalized case, and whether there's second-class status in some cases. I think all those are legitimate issues to discuss. The term genocide being applied is really, I have to say, ridiculous. The Muslim birth rate in Israel is greater than the Jewish birth rate. If Israel was trying to commit genocide, it's doing an incredibly poor job of that. You don't commit genocide by allowing the victim groups to have Supreme Court justices, members of parliament, cabinet ministers, police officials, etc., diplomats. All those are present from the Muslim Arab world in Israeli society. That is not a form of genocide. So to apply it to Israel is just a total crude distortion and manipulation of the facts to attempt to elicit political support to destroy, delegitimize the state of Israel. And that I reject totally. The next, there are 2 more questions that I guess we can get to. The last 2 about the congressional testimony. The question is, how do we balance out political grandstanding? So I think the issue, and this is why I focused a little bit on the bipartisan nature of the House and Senate task forces on anti-Semitism. There is political grandstanding, and it's unfortunate. In my talks and in presence in Washington, I've always tried to make things bipartisan, and I've said bluntly, including at congressional testimony, that if you want to target anti-Semitism from a political aspect, the only way to do it is by really targeting your own party first, looking inwardly first. You can't do it if you're a Republican by targeting Democrats and calling them woke and progressive, and you can't do it if you're a Democrat by targeting Republicans and calling them, neo-Nazi extremists. There may be aspects of those charges that are true, but because you're doing it to score political points, it's basically going to get lost. The only way you can do this if you have legitimacy of saying that, yeah, this part of my party, this person, these people are saying anti-Semitic things, and I call them out on it, and I vote against it, and so on and so forth. Oh, and by the way, and on your side, you've got to do the same with that person, that statement, that thing. The only way to have legitimacy, I think, in this argument is to really be seen as being fair and impartial, which means really not being afraid to take on the extremists on your own side, ostensibly on your own side first. And then you have grounds to stand on, moral and political grounds to stand on when you target, the other one. But if, and by the way, and there are Jews who do this as well, Jews who are aligned with a political party or with a political philosophy and use anti-Semitism, weaponize it to make political points. I don't like it when others do it, and I don't like it when Jews do it. We have to be consistent, we have to be fair, and we have to be able to say that we recognize it wherever it's found, even if it's found in groups that we would otherwise be sympathetic with. Two last questions I could actually squeeze in. IHRA is IHRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and it's 35 member countries now, with about 5 countries who are pending to join. That was created about 25 years ago to be the only intergovernmental group dealing with issues of the Holocaust initially, education, research, and remembrance, and expanded to anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial over the years. It's not politically binding and legally binding. In other words, the things that IHRA do have no legal authority, but there's a political commitment by the countries that join, because when they join, they're joining on behalf of their government. The foreign minister or someone like that at that level is the official applicant representing the country, and they have making a political and moral commitment to working on these issues. And that's where this definition of anti-Semitism was originally passed. I did not have any expectation that it would grow to what it's grown now. I thought it was a major accomplishment getting it for use in IHRA, because, as I said, we had all these representatives from different countries. From some of them, English is not their first language. They work in different fields. Some are diplomats, some were academics, historians, some worked in museums and memorials, some were educators, some were representatives of Jewish or communal groups. And we needed to be clear what we were talking about. That's where the definition sort of began in some ways. And then it got adopted by country after country and institution after institution, because it obviously filled a need, unfortunately, at this time. So that's IHRA. I'm very short. And you can find out more online about it. And is the UN anti-Semitic? That's not an easy question to answer. There's anti-Semitism in the UN. Certainly, the anti-Semitism in the Human Rights Council in Geneva is really strong. Certainly, there are UN groups such as the group that was set up for Palestinian issues that focuses only on that issue and totally one-sided, and is veered into anti-Semitism. Is the UN in New York anti-Semitic? The General Assembly, I wouldn't say they're anti-Semitic. I think there are times they're overly critical of Israel, that this double standard is applied. There's way too much attention paid to Israel in the UN and in other places in the world compared to other crises that are ongoing right now and that no one seems to care about or talk about, whether it's in Africa or Asia or places like that, including human rights issues. There's certainly potential or problems in the UN, but at the same time, just to point out, over the past few years, the UN has passed General Assembly has passed resolutions on anti-Semitism, on Holocaust denial. Adopted January 27th as an International Day of Remembrance for the Holocaust. Has created an Office of Holocaust Education in the United Nations itself. So there are, it's not just totally a one-sided element. And as one Israeli diplomat said to me once we were talking about it, it's hard to know how many conflicts were prevented, how many issues were resolved because of the UN gave the opportunity for people to meet and have informal conversations, Israelis and supporters of Israel, US, and so on, with neutral or even hostile countries, and they were able to get past something. And we never know how many of those conversations happened or the instances that happened. So I'm not going to say that the UN itself is anti-Semitic, but I'm going to say that there are a lot of times and places where parts of the UN engage in anti-Semitic acts. I didn't even mention UNRWA, the refugee group, and the anti-Semitic or anti-stereotypes and anti-Israeli stereotypes that they've found in their textbooks and so on. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the UN, um, but I'll hesitate about saying that UN is, totally anti-Semitic itself. Okay. I think we've run out of time. We run out of time. Best of my knowledge, we've run out of time. So I'm going to stop here. I want to thank you for your participation. I apologize again for the glitch earlier with the video, with the visuals. Thank you very much for the questions. They were great questions. And I hope at some point in the near future we can get together in the same room and continue the conversation. But I really wish everyone here both safety and security, and good luck in dealing and navigating through these very difficult and unprecedented times, and to understand that we don't proceed, history does not proceed in a straight line. We go in cycles. We've had cycles that have been terrible in the United States before, maybe perhaps not the same way. I believe that we can overcome this by working together ourselves with our allies, by being accurate to the facts, to the history, to the reality, and being aware of what's going on, and what we need and can do together. We will be able to get past this. Um, but in the meantime, if there's any help that we can offer, well, I'm sure on behalf of I shouldn't be speaking on behalf of the Holocaust Museum, but I will anyway, Education Center. And on my behalf, anything we can do to help you, we're more than happy to do that. Thank you again.